Boa noite.
Good evening to all of you. Tonight we continue with our third day of the event, Marx and Marxism 2021. I would like to thank enormously our speakers for today, Professor Andreas Malm and sociologist Sabrina Fernandes, and all of our audience. So we will begin this third panel. I will briefly introduce our guests. We will hear first Professor Sabrina Fernandes, and after her, Professor Andreas Malm. After their comments, we will have some blocks of questions to both speakers. So please submit your questions to the event's email, which is mm.niepmarx@niepmarx.blog.br. All questions must be submitted to this email so that we can organize them for the panelists. So beginning with Sabrina Fernandes, very well known to all of us. She is a sociologist, a researcher in the graduate sociology program in the Brasilia University. She has a MS and a PhD in sociology. Her thesis was presented in the Carleton University in Canada. It was also awarded a prize, and in 2019 it was published as a book under the title The Crossroads of the Brazilian Left. She has been contributing to the publication JEC in Brazil, where she discusses environment, socialism, and besides, Sabrina has a very important work in terms of scientific dissemination in her YouTube channel, Thesis 11, since 2017. Several topics are discussed in her YouTube channel with a very accessible language, but without compromising the complexity of the discussions. Professor Andreas Malm is a professor of human ecology at Lund University, Sweden. He is a part of the board of the Historical Materialism publication, and he contributes with articles. He has a vast written works, articles about environmental studies, among them Foster Capital from 2016, product of his PhD thesis in London University. The book received the Deutscher Award, and in 2020, Professor Malm also wrote a book about the economic impacts of coronavirus, coronas, climate, and chronic emergency. And more recently, as we say in Brazil, just out of the oven this year, Professor Malm published 2 more books. On the pipeline, I'm sorry, I didn't get the titles. Both of them were published this year. So without further ado, I give the floor to our speakers, beginning with Professor Sabrina Fernandes, and afterwards, Professor Andreas Malm. Sabrina, you have the floor. Thank you, Tatiana. Good evening to all of you, wherever you are, in social media or in this event. Very excited to discuss the NIEP-Marx topics this year. They contribute greatly. The center contributes greatly to Brazilian researchers, and it's an urgent topic, and very happy to be here. I thought about what I could speak about today, and I must say I am quite pessimistic because of the last IPCC report last week. We cannot celebrate it, although the feeling among the scientific community brings some kind of a relief, because we know that things are becoming more difficult and urgent, and the negationists or the denialists cannot thrive in this environment. I've been talking about the transition in the world, Andreas also, and I decided to begin with the global South perspective, not only Brazil, but also Latin America, around which I have been traveling lately. And we are also dealing with great fatalism. So at the same time that we have a natural climate science, we who study ecology, sociology, and other fields, unfortunately, her connection is crashing. And also when we speak about data and books more specifically, this makes us quite disappointed, and I've been concerned by seeing people's reactions about the data that shows that the situation is no longer reversible. So when we say that most of the ice caps will not be recovered and that we have so many irreversible impacts, when we reach 5 degrees more of global warming, maybe in about 20 years, many people simply give up and say, oh, this is the end of the world. And curiously enough, I've also seen some strange discourses, not only in the Malthusian sense of talking about the world population, as some from the fascist fields say, but the anti-natalism in the sense of a lack of hope, meaning there's nothing more to do, so why should we keep reproducing? And I also touched upon this recently with some groups, and it is exactly what we would like to avoid, the end of the human species on Earth. And so we don't want this to happen. So let us not stop to reproduce. But this is a result of this generalized fatalism that shows failures in some government programs and also in the negotiations, which year after year, the negotiations around the climate involving the UN and several government coalitions, and nothing is done in this sense because the most basic thing to be questioned in these spaces is not questioned, is not put into question, which is capitalism as the system that brought us to this point. And it is very important when we see data coming out stating that there is no doubt that the reasons behind climate change are of human nature. And this is important for us to talk against the denials and talk about the sun and volcanoes, etc. But it is also very concerning because people still insist on treating this as if it were a generalized thing of humankind and not of our current society and system. So putting a name to the system is important, and this is our function at NIEP-Marx Center. We need to qualify it. So if the report does not publish the system, it is our task to do so. And it is a great concern that many people have understood that there is no more hope to solve the capitalist problem now that the clock is ticking away. So in this context, the debate on the transition is increasingly necessary and should be in the mouths of all leftists and their representatives, whether they are revolutionary or not, everyone who is concerned with our life on Earth. But this is still not our reality. It is very clear that the agenda of the climate and ecological crisis in general is still treated as something secondary. And in Latin America, it is a very sensitive issue because many times a kind of false opposition to the idea of sovereignty is created, the idea of countering the imperialist states that are carrying out coups around the region, and they give the idea that the solution would be to appropriate of our own resources before the imperialists come and take over them. This is a failure, of course, because this kind of sovereignty would only last for a couple of decades, and it would contribute to add to the global generalized problem, which is the lack of international solidarity, which should be one of the principles of international socialism. And therefore, it ends up being ignored when ecological crisis is put in the second place and only discussed when there is an emergency. We see this a lot in Brazil because Bolsonaro administration is clearly anti-ecological. This was very evident when the Minister of Agriculture left his position, but it doesn't mean that when he was replaced, things improved. There are some ministers that are very loud, that attract a lot of attention, but maybe it would be preferable to have a minister that is not so outspoken, but that absolves, that advances more in this context. So because of this, we see that in the Brazilian leftists, there is greater concern with the environment, contrary to the president, because we have reached to a total lack of control in our nature, a very big setback with regards to indigenous people's lives. Today, there are 7,000 indigenous people camping out in front of the president's palace, complaining. And there is also our biomes that are catching on fire, very high rates of deforestation, and Brazil still denies climate change. So it is very clear that Brazilian leftists must take a stance. But very little is said about how we can advance beyond resisting the government, because it's not sufficient to hold back the government setbacks if we don't bring about radical change. And that is where things get even worse. In Latin America, we have governments that are strongly dependent on extractivism for their industry. So they extract resources and sell them as commodities to be industrialized and processed in other continents. And the leftist governments and leftist parties have also internalized this process. So when we talk about bringing about a big transition and promoting a major decarbonization project, it seems that it is something impossible that would go against the country's development or the region's development, and that we want to prevent them from using the riches of the country. This might be somewhat meaningful when you look at the greater responsibility that we have today that lies in the northern countries, such as the US and Canada, and especially the European Union. But in spite of that, it doesn't put us in the position that we must not say anything and simply sit back and wait for what they will do. The situation is so extreme that even in the richest countries, the emissions cut will have to be very drastic, and even in our countries also, because Brazil is very poorly positioned in this sense. We are greater emitters also because of deforestation, because of different types of land use, because of the degradation of land for pasture. And after we count the agribusiness and its effects in the country, we don't even have to include the industry of the country. They are not the greatest risk. So discussing the transition in the sense of decarbonization in Brazil is quite a different discussion than when you discuss the Green New Deal in the US or in Europe, because one of our more central contexts for any transition process is the agrarian reform and the definition of indigenous lands. This does not pertain so much to other scenarios because it is not as important with regards to private property as it is in Brazil. So our elites her connection crashed, and the structure of agribusiness and the big mining companies. So our position is that we should go back to some topics and agendas to avoid thinking that it is sufficient to have a transition in our energy matrix from fossil fuels to renewables, because we know that the more the hydro plants are not totally renewable, actually, they are quite a complicated deal. And my first research was to assess the impacts of the two recent hydro plants built in the state of Rondônia in the north. And the PT party made a very big confusion to have the two projects approved. But it's not a matter of changing our energy matrix to renewables, because our energy is not based on coal as in other countries. However, we must acknowledge that the state of Roraima in the north of Brazil is totally disconnected from the Brazilian power grid, and they have to buy electricity from other countries. They had to buy it from Venezuela until a short while ago. And when it was no longer possible, they began using diesel fuel. So the state of Roraima is basically based on diesel fuel, and this is not at all efficient with regards to the state's finances. So there is still a lot to do, and therefore the territorial issue in Brazil is something that is totally outside of our reality. Some years ago, since the Green New Deal began to be more discussed, and this was a contribution of the United States, that connection again, but never as strong as in the last 3 years. So what we see is that there was an attempt to follow the Green New Deal, or rather to bring it from outside into Brazil, but it does not include the specific demands for a more fair transition as we need in Latin America. And this also undermines the work of workers in extractivism, and this puts us in a delicate situation to understand how the Petrobras employees or big mining companies employees will do. We know that there is a large rate of what she calls ecocides, homicides among mining workers, and they're trying to organize, and also with environmentalists. And they brought about the idea that the energy transition would mean unemployment. So what we notice in the Green New Deal project is that in order to prevent this idea that the Green New Deal will cut off jobs, they started teaching that it would be the opposite, that it would create new jobs. But then that led to another problem, which is that they would have to have an economic stimulus package. So either all in Brazil and abroad, people are treating the decarbonization projects as an green economic package that will bring more jobs and more industry, especially with the current coronavirus crisis, and that it would help us to recover our economic losses. So all the necessary discussions that the industries need to take on, that several industries need to be abolished entirely, and radical decisions need to be made so that we can recover as much as we can in the next 20 years. These discussions are annihilated, and the easy idea is favored, that the Green New Deal is simply an incentive for growth and development. Some time ago, I wrote an article with other colleagues from Latin America speaking about ecosocialism from the margins or from the peripheries. Our concern is how this can impact our possibility to carry out the transition, because there is a strong inequality between our responsibilities in the South and those of the North. But we also understand that in order to have a successful transition, we cannot simply follow the model of a simple transition into a green capitalism. And this places us facing a series of questions that involve the participation of the public segment, and that the private segment should not receive so many incentives, that the incentives should go to the public segment, and that the jobs that are created should be good jobs and not any kind of job. A Brazilian government agency researched the jobs in the renewables segment in Brazil, and they concluded that they are much worse than in the fossil fuel industry. And now even more so with the Bolsonaro government selling Petrobras's share in wind farms and solar farms, and so on and so forth. So the public segment is very necessary, but it does not suffice to keep to that, because that will simply maintain the system as it is, maybe a little lighter with a social democracy, but it will not go beyond that. And where is ecosocialism? How can we really provide a rupture with the system? Sabrina Fernandes in the 70s discussed the non-reformist reforms as being necessary to ensure the necessary conditions for the future. But at the same time, we should also have some more radical ruptures. So the need to formulate a strategy where agrarian reform, for example, is seen as a non-reformist reform, because it will not be a revolutionary rupture with capitalism, but it does stir up the private property of land in Brazil and in other parts of Latin America in a way that would be a reorganization of the economic system, and the workers would appropriate part of the production means, considering land and not industry. So this reform is not reformist, because it is possible to start from this agrarian reform to something more advanced, to other forms of production. So when you carry out agrarian reform, you can think about the popular agroecology in this agrarian reform. What would be its role in recovering part of our nature, which has been devastated? So it would be something broader. Now, we also need to think about other things beyond that, which sound quite obnoxious to the leftists. A few years ago, when I said that it would be necessary to abolish Petrobras, they looked at me with a very strange face. They thought that it was very imperialistic to want to destroy Petrobras. And I said that our role as Marxists is to understand the boiling point there, because it starts with dialectic. So it's not simply to approve a law to destroy Petrobras or to do away with Petrobras, but it requires other things. Yeah, her connection is very bad now again. And we also see that the private foreign shareholders have an interest, and their interests are stronger than the Brazilian population's interest. And we can see that gasoline prices are soaring in Brazil. So Petrobras does have to cease to exist. But how can we do that? We need to go through a transition process that uses our state-owned companies, and radical enough to say that no, we do not want the pre-salt oil to fund education. This was a very convenient manner of convincing Brazilians and that we had an oil sovereignty, because that industry would pay for our health and education. But it came to a point that the leftists started shouting out that we can have 100 years of energy autonomy if we use the pre-salt oil. But what kind of 100 years will we have? In 50 years, we won't even have any land anymore. So our discussion about this moratorium is very late. When you say that you have to offset this and for others, and when we discuss with the right wings, which in Latin America represents a very wild capitalism that destroys nature and that uses authoritarian methods for that, which is exactly what I'm studying for my postdoctorate thesis. But other aspects are also normalized along these lines, that we need to exploit and continue to be extractivist to ensure our position. And then later on, we would carry out a transition as if we had the time for that. And this is a very sensitive point for us now because of the advance of discussions about energy transition in the global north. We can tell that there is a new extractivism phase, which is the green extractivism, which tries to amass resources from peripheral countries using their mineral riches to facilitate the energy transition using green technology, but in the northern countries, as if we didn't have such an unequal situation here, including the fact that most investments in these green technologies are made by the global north and under patents. So since 2010, nothing is being discussed at the UN about the permanent breach of patents for the green technologies, for climate transition. And in many places where a decarbonization process or transition project is thought about within boundaries is very strange, because facing this global ecological crisis, borders do not matter with regards to the impacts. Borders only determine responsibility and who will be able to mitigate them or not. But when things need to circulate, and when the global temperature rises, we know that the decarbonization project limited to a country doesn't make any sense. And in Brazil, if one of our major priorities is to recover and protect the Amazon forest, how can we discuss that without thinking about Bolivia, for example? So it's not something that concerns only ourselves. It requires multilateral, regional collaboration and special attention that Brazil could be performing this role, maybe not with this government, but I don't know if it would also have functioned properly with Lula or Dilma's government. We think of the Caribbean countries that are in such a delicate situation and already feeling most of the impacts right now. But we end up realizing that proposals are still very closed within the borders of the countries. There are some initiatives in Latin America that have been seeking greater dialogue when we talk about Argentina and the Mercosur bloc, and also the Ecosocial Petro acquisition in Brazil, and nothing like, we don't have anything close to a recipe for what has to be done. What we need to do is debate. As I said in the Brazilian case, all our debates on transition, again, her connection crashed. And this is very important. But somehow this means that we could at least engage about the necessary conditions for a transition. And then with the transition, we would then be able to increase our class consciousness among our workers. I had a debate 1 or 2 months ago with Professor Eduardo here. We were discussing this text because it might convey the idea that we will define the conditions, and then that this would be a reformist rationale that would remain in the system. So I'm not talking about simple macroeconomic measures that can bring the necessary incentives in the Brazilian economy so that we can have the transition. It would be something focused on the workers themselves and to make good use of the frustration of the population and turn it into something more productive. Because in our surveys, we see that most people acknowledge climate change as a big issue. They have a strong environmental concern, and it might even be a kind of a side effect of the disaster of Bolsonaro's government. But the frustration makes people think that they cannot solve the problem. And at the same time, we have all the fallacies about green capitalism, etc. And her connection crashes again. And of actual fantasies related to carbon capture, geoengineering, that sound very interesting when you see a science fiction movie, but which are still not our reality. But they sell books, and we know that Bill Gates' book is selling a lot because it does provide very comfortable lies to us. And aspects like reproduction of life and consumption. Connection bad again. So these fantasies are very comfortable. They are part of the ideological system. So either we are fatalist or we are too accommodated. And right now, I see that we are in a phase in which, although we have the people who deny climate change, and even people who think that the world is flat and other bizarre ideas, our great risk now with the deniers is to keep business as usual. It's the rationale of trying to extract as much profit as you can today, and at the same time maintain some more investment in other segments, because the renewables is diversifying the funds. So investment funds are diversifying, so they can invest both in fossil fuels and in green technologies and renewables, as well as other segments that are related to this. So when you have a project of turning forests into the commoditization of forests, you have the investment in a project that is so much focused on the carbon market as if it were a feasible alternative and not simply the financial system being creative in order to profit more and more. So to conclude my comments, I believe that one thing that is very necessary is the understanding of survival, that we will have to make very difficult decisions, that they will not please everyone, and that this is a very current and severe issue among the Latin American left wings that are still continue with the same old antique idea of development as the only way to prevent imperialist sovereignty. But we are actually more and more vulnerable because the imperialists will take advantage of this new wave of green extractivism. They will carry out their transition in their way, with their investments, with their capital, and they won't even help to have mitigation measures. So we will be in the position of having to reorganize our ethos of the leftists, and I think we still have a lot to contribute to the debate. And it is not a debate that is isolated and that is not only focused on fighting against the rightist authoritarianism. One thing is not isolated from the other. So ecosocialists, even though we fight against Bolsonaro, we must also support these radical measures. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sabrina. Now we will go to Professor Andreas Malm. You have the floor.
Thank you. I hope you can hear me. Indicate otherwise.
It's good.
Okay, good. So thank you, Comrade Sabrina, for these thoughtful remarks. Very thoughtful indeed. And thank you to the organizers for inviting me. It's a real honor to talk to you. I think this is the first time I speak to a Brazilian audience, and I should point out that my knowledge of Latin America is very limited. I've never been to Latin America. The closest I've come is to the Caribbean. So I'm, I mean, don't expect any insights on the situation in Latin America from me. I can only offer a few general remarks on the situation, how I see it from my perspective. I'm based in Sweden. I've done research on vulnerability to climate crisis in Egypt, but generally most of my activity in the climate movement has been, or all of my activism in the climate movement has been in Europe. So that's where I come from, so to speak. I should say that I completely share Comrade Sabrina's pessimism or despair, if that's the right word, in response to the recent IPCC report and to this past summer, which really has been a season in global hell. I haven't really felt this way since the summer of 2018, which was really, really bad up here in Northern Europe. But this summer has been worse. And it sort of began with the unprecedented heat wave, as you probably remember, in Canada, in British Columbia, where the salmon boasted, while all of a sudden 600 people, something like that, expired in this heat wave. And this was a sign of the onset of an early 21st century summer. And then, of course, there followed another record-breaking season of wildfires in the U.S. Pacific Northwest, still not over as we speak now. And forests in the Mediterranean basin have been reduced to soot. I'm sure you've seen this clip where hundreds of people are being evacuated from the Greek island of Evia, and all around them, they're taken out of the ferry. All around them, the mountainsides are, the pretty steep mountainsides are just plowing with fire. And at least as bad a situation in Algeria and in Turkey, where the wildfires just broke all records. And barely had Turkey come to grips with the just dizzying devastation before you had these flash floods in the northern part of the country, sweeping away towns and villages and killing hundreds of people. And we've had similar floods in Western Germany, where quite shocking for people in that country, I believe, in China, in South Sudan, in Myanmar, in the Indian state of Maharashtra, and most recently in the American state of Tennessee. So it's been a planet by turns on fire and underwater. And then we've had the extreme heat in places like Pakistan and Iran, and Madagascar is in a terrible state because of climate-induced famine, essentially, due to drought. But one of the remarkable things about the summer is that these extreme weather events have now hit deep into some of the most affluent parts of the world, such as the Rhineland, Western Germany, and California. And still, it goes on. It just goes on. And even if we now have a president of the United States who recognizes the existence of the climate crisis and has even said that climate will be everywhere in his policy, he is currently busy handing out licenses for drilling for oil and gas on public lands at a pace not seen since George W. Bush was president. So he's doing it at a greater pace, greater speed than what Donald Trump did. And he's been recently putting his pressure on OPEC to produce more oil, so there is no rise in the price of oil. And on the northern slopes of Alaska, ConocoPhillips, one of the oil giants in the US, has Biden's blessing to construct new pipelines. But because the permafrost is melting, the company has to artificially freeze the ground to hold them in place, so more oil can be conveyed to the world market for burning. Over in Canada, you have Enbridge blasting and bulldozing its way through indigenous lands to build pipelines for tar sands oil. And in Britain, the government is planning to open the new Cambo oil field near the Shetland Islands and a new deep coal mine in Cumbria, not to mention the third runway at Heathrow. In Germany, Angela Merkel has rejected calls to phase out.
Excuse me, Andreas. Yep. I'm sorry to interrupt you. There is a weird noise in the back, like a scratch sound.
I'm in a completely silent room. Shall I?
No, it's your microphone. It's your microphone that is touching either your skin or one to the other.
Let me. I'll remove this and see if it works better. Okay.
Okay, we're getting the static and noise from you all the times.
Okay, sorry about that.
Okay.
Is this better?
Much better.
Much better,
Thank you
okay.
so much. Okay, I'm sorry to interrupt you.
No. You should have done so earlier. I'm sorry to impose noise on you.
No,
okay, I'll resume.
So could you resume and summarize a little bit of what you just said, because it was really difficult to follow you.
I'm just going through some of the more egregious cases of continued expansion of fossil fuel infrastructure in advanced capitalist countries. And the most recent example that I was coming to is Germany, where you have Germany is the country that produces most lignite coal in the world, and lignite coal is the dirtiest of all fossil fuels. And Angela Merkel has again rejected recently, or she did so in May, I believe, calls for an immediate phase out of this energy source, and said that it will happen in 2038 at the earliest. So for another 2 decades at least, we'll have these lignite mines continuing to expand and send even more of the dirtiest fossil fuels to the furnaces. A country that is often forgotten in these discussions is France. The single largest private company based in France is Total. And Total is currently constructing what will be the world's longest heated oil pipeline in Eastern Africa. So this pipeline will carry oil from oil fields near Lake Alberta on the border of the Democratic Republic of Congo and Uganda. And it will carry this oil through Uganda and through Tanzania and to the sea and to the world market for even more of this oil to be burned. And Emmanuel Macron, the French president, who is also, of course, formally, nominally paying lip service to the reality of the climate crisis, he's egging Total on in Africa as in the Arctic, where this company is going to drill for even more fossil gas. And we know that what we experienced this summer is just a foretaste of global warming. Or I'm not sure this insight really has percolated, because there's this misconception that, this is what a warming world looks like. But no, there is no stability in a global, in a rapidly warming world. There is no average. There's no new baseline. Instead, it gets worse and worse the more CO2 is being emitted. The extreme weather events that we are experiencing right now is the outcome of the total accumulation of CO2 in the atmosphere. And the more CO2 is put into the atmosphere, the worse it will get, because the problem is cumulative to its very nature. So a few years down the road, this summer might very well look quite benevolent in hindsight. The absurdity here, of course, is that the ruling classes are in a kind of compulsive fashion just throwing more fuel on the fires. Of course, this is precisely the situation that generates the fatalism that Sabrina spoke about initially. And because of the cumulative nature of the problem, and because we've waited so long with climate action, extremely radical measures have to be undertaken. And the longer we wait, the more radical, the more revolutionary will the actions have to be taken. I mean, if mitigation had begun in the 1990s, you could have imagined a very gradual process of cutting emissions by 1% per year or something like that. But now that we've built up so much CO2 in the atmosphere, to stay below any threshold like 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees or any other threshold, soon you have to undertake extremely swift and comprehensive emissions cuts on the scale of something like maybe 10% per year or something. And this rise in the magnitude of the political task as the situation just continues produces a kind of an agency gap, because the more radical measures that have to be undertaken, the more subversive or transformational will the political project have to be. And it becomes more and more difficult to envision the existing order being able to deal with the problem the longer this goes on. And the International Energy Agency, which is a completely bourgeois mainstream institution that was founded to essentially facilitate fossil fuel consumption in the consuming countries in response to the formation of OPEC. This institution recently declared that the only chance to stay below 1.5 degrees is to have no new fossil fuel installations, not a single new pipeline or coal mine or liquefied gas terminal or airport or anything of that kind. No new installations. And this now comes off as an extremely radical demand, really this kind of non-reformist reform that Sabrina spoke about, or a transitional demand even. A demand that is extremely basic, but that collides directly with the mechanisms of business as usual. And it goes against the very modus operandi of fossil fuel companies, because it's in their very nature to build new installations, to replace old depleted oil and gas fields and coal mines. You have to build new ones. And like all capitalist companies, Enbridge or ConocoPhillips or RWE in Germany or any other fossil fuel company, they want to grow, they want to expand, they compulsively have to do it to survive on the market. And recently, more and more people have started to raise the demand that these companies, insofar as they are private, have to be nationalized. And I was very heartened to hear Sabrina speaking about abolishing Petrobras. This, of course, being a state-owned oil company, and in quite a few places around the world, oil and gas companies are state-owned. But there's also a very important part of the world where oil and gas and coal companies are private. The world's single largest producer of oil and gas these days is the US, where the entire sector is private. In Germany, the main producer of lignite coal, as I said, the coal industry is private. In Australia, which is the world's largest coal exporter, the entire coal industry is, of course, private. These companies just cannot continue existing, and that goes for the state-owned as well. If humanity is to continue existing on this planet, it's really a choice. It's either these companies or humanity. And to begin with, of course, the most vulnerable people in the global south, in countries like Madagascar, Somalia, Iran, or around, places in Latin America and the Caribbean and elsewhere. So a very fundamental transitional demand would be for these companies to be taken into public control, and transformed into completely different entities. And insofar as they are already under state ownership, to give them completely different directives. So, of course, state ownership is no guarantee, we know that, for these companies to behave any better, Petrobras being one a case in point. But in the situations where these companies are private, the first step is to put them under public control, and that essentially means socializing. You might have heard of this case in the Netherlands, where a court ruled that Shell has to cut its emissions by, I think it's 50% or something like that, to 2030. And Shell is naturally extremely upset about this ruling and is trying to appeal and overturn it. We don't know what will happen, and we don't know if that verdict will stand and be executed. But what it points to is precisely the logic of public authorities, the states, ordering private fossil fuel companies to shut down their operations. And the end point of this is, of course, to take them over and expropriate them. I would suggest without compensation. I would also suggest that these companies be maintained, not just thrown on the scrap heap, but kept and transformed into entities for doing other kinds of work than what they're doing right now. So not just abolish Petrobras or Shell or Exxon and just throw them away, but repurpose their enormous apparatus of technologies and skills to draw down CO2 instead of pumping more of it into the atmosphere. And I'm not going to go on a whole digression into the technologies of direct air capture and things like that. Instead, I'll just stay on a general abstract level here, because Eduardo asked me to say something about war communism and ecological Leninism. And These are terms that I toyed with in a little book that I wrote last year about the Corona crisis. I believe it was mentioned in the beginning. And that's a book that I wrote I speed wrote it in 6 weeks in Berlin. And I think I spent about a week on these themes of war communism and ecological Leninism. So I'm happy to admit that there are very weak and problematic formulations about these things. And it was a very rough sketch that I outlined. I'm also happy to say that more people than myself are thinking in these terms if there's anything from the Leninist legacy that might be of use in the present moment. So I think it's on the 25th of September, a month from now, there will be an online event where Jody Dean, Kai Heron, and I will discuss ecological Leninism. There's another project that I'll mention shortly. But the argument that I made in that book, or that I tried to make, was that when Lenin really came to the fore in Russia, or the Bolsheviks rather, it was in a situation of war, an extreme emergency. And the argument that he made, and of course also Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht and other parts of the anti-war left in Europe, between 1914 and 1917-18, was that this catastrophe that we are living in is being sustained by capitalist governments that have to compulsively keep throwing millions to be slaughtered on the battlefields. And the only way to end this war is to transform it into a revolutionary crisis where we topple those governments and make sure that we don't have this kind of inter-imperialist wars fundamentally driven by the mechanisms of capital accumulation by deposing the dominant classes. And this, of course, meant in Russia the provisional government. And the Leninist gesture here, or strategic orientation, was to go after the root causes, the drivers of the problem. And I think we need a similar move now, where we try to transform the moments of crisis, as in the moments when extreme weather events and other impacts of global warming hit, into political crisis for the drivers of these catastrophes. And here, I think the climate movement has really failed. The climate movement in the global north has really failed so far. It was nowhere to be seen this summer. The climate movement in the global north reached a kind of historical peak in 2019 and seemed to be going from strength to strength up to the point of the pandemic. When it broke out, the movement just completely froze and suspended all activities. And since then, it's been nowhere to be seen. This means that the floods in Germany, the wildfires in the US Pacific Northwest, the wildfires in Greece, in France, have not been met with any kind of climate activism targeting the causes of these disasters. So you would imagine at some point that people in Germany, for instance, would say, we can't have any more coal burning in this country, because if we do, we just condemn ourselves, not to mention others, to more of this misery, to the point where we can't continue living. The same in Greece, which also has coal mines and is crisscrossed by oil and gas pipelines in the Arctic, not to mention the US, obviously. Also, the climate movement in the global north has had what I would call a mechanical calendar, where it has scheduled its actions to certain Fridays or days of action or dates that coincide with UN summits. But so far, there has been no concerted climate action dated to the disasters themselves. So that these disasters happen without any response that targets the actual sources, namely fossil fuel combustion. And all the focus is on evacuating people from the zone of danger and adapting and surviving. And I think the essential application of Leninist politics here is the insight that unless we succeed in shifting the focus to the causes, to the drivers, rather than to the symptoms, we are condemned to ever more this until the point where we can't live with it any longer. And of course, already quite a few people cannot live with it any longer because they're dying. And then my argument was more generally, okay, what in the socialist legacy is relevant for the present moment? And very simplified, because this argument was extremely crude, very simplified, we have three currents in the socialist, from the socialist movement: social democracy as a reformist project, anarchism, and revolutionary Marxism identified with the Leninist tradition. And my argument in the book was that social democracy in its classical form is premised on gradual change, on the idea that we have a lot of time at our disposal, so we can incrementally, slowly, gradually implement reform after reform that will take us to something like a socialist society. This doesn't work any longer because we don't have time at our disposal. This moment is characterized by there being no time at our disposal, by delay being fatal, a phrase that Lenin loved to repeat throughout 1917, but also actually during the great crisis in the Bolshevik Party in early 1918 surrounding the question of a separate peace with Germany, where Lenin argued that we cannot allow the war to continue. Delay is fatal. We have to immediately sign this peace agreement with Germany, however distasteful it is. So Lenin was in both 1917 and in 1918 arguably the two big crisis points in the Bolshevik Party, where he pushed the party to in 1917 seize power, and in 1918 to sign this peace agreement with Germany. He was a politician of restlessness and of impatience, and that's the kind of relation to time and temporality that we need now as well. Anarchism, on the other hand, of course, rejects the state, while my argument would be that the state is absolutely indispensable, not because currently existing states are doing anything good. To the contrary, they are constitutionally incapable, obviously, of doing anything good, but it's very hard to envision any other institution being at least hypothetically capable of dealing with these problems than the state, as in, for instance, taking over companies and transforming them, fossil fuel companies. I'll try to be brief here. I could speak more about the idea of ecological Leninism. It's not necessarily an idea that says that original, actually existing Leninism was, to its essence, an ecological project. That's not the point. It's just an argument around applying certain aspects of Leninist politics in the present. And I think that any appropriation of Lenin's work has to be selective. It's not a matter of just copying what the Bolsheviks did, because not all of what they did was good, not all of it worked. And we're obviously in a completely different political epoch where the parameters are, they belong to another historical universe than what he was acting. That said, I just can't resist the temptation to mention that I'm involved in a project, not because I read or speak Russian, but I'm involved in a project where colleagues are translating an immense treasure trove of texts from the early years after the Russian Revolution, where people in the emerging Bolshevik state, well, first it was of course a Soviet state, I should say, rather then became a one-party state, as we know. But people in the Soviet state working on energy and on natural sciences, the biosphere, and conservation in an extremely cutting-edge fashion. So I was just sent a note that apparently reached Lenin and that he signed in April 1921 about the necessity of expanding wind power and doing research on wind power. So there's a lot of very interesting stuff that will come out in these books to be called October Ecologies. They will be out in a couple of years or so. Now, on war communism, I think I might leave that out and we can return to it. It was partly provocation, but partly also a different way to talk about communism than a certain kind of discourse that I don't know if it's reached you in Brazil. I sort of hope it hasn't, but it's been very much in vogue in the UK in particular in recent years. This is the sort of meme of a fully automated luxury communism, where people imagine that with extremely advanced technologies we'll have extreme supply of all the goods that we need so that everyone can live in luxury and we can go to the asteroids and mine them for rare materials and things like that. And I think this is a fairly pernicious way of conceiving communism. And I think that in a way, war communism is more apt model for our period, because what war communism was an attempt to survive one disaster piled on top of another. So the First World War, the Civil War, the epidemics that ravaged Soviet Russia in the early years after the revolution, the collapse of the economy, the virtual breakdown of the social order. And this is not, of course, to argue that we should have armed detachments sent out into the countryside like the Bolsheviks did in 1918-19. But if you think about communism in the coming decades, it's not going to be established under conditions of extreme supply, as in we can all just, wade in abundance. It's going to have to be established under conditions rather of shortages, very basic shortages. I mean, sea level rise is already in the pipeline to submerge swathes of southern Iraq, for instance. So Iraq is going to face a supply crisis of the most fundamental assets of all, namely land to stand on. And central Iraq is already turning into a dust bowl because of the climate crisis. And it's not honest to imagine communism in these circumstances being about a total abundance of everything, but rather a matter of trying to redistribute resources in a situation of loss, not gain, and of course an attempt to restore as much as possible of all that has been lost. And communism in the 21st century will be very much about trying to restore resources that capitalist development has destroyed. Now, I had imagined that I would have time to offer some remarks on the tactics of the climate movement, but I'll skip that and just endorse what Sabrina said towards the end about geoengineering. And one fear I have simmering in me after a summer like this is that after another few seasons in global hell like these, and these seasons will, as I said, be worse, it will be, I mean, it's easy to imagine a government or a military, an institution like the Pentagon, initiating solar geoengineering, solar radiation management. So sending airplanes into the stratosphere to inject soot to dim the sun. Because, as I said, the longer this goes on, the more revolutionary the change will have to be. And the more difficult the political task for us, who frankly are quite weak in political terms. And the more unlikely that the dominant classes themselves will initiate the required change. But at some point, unless we think that, societies just accept that they will go out of business and expire passively, at some point, presumably, governments will scramble for some kind of fix, for some kind of solution that can give instant relief and reduce temperatures. And there is only one known technology that has the potential to do that, and that is solar geoengineering. And it's so in line with how our societies operate. If there is a crisis, you deal with the symptoms. So the COVID crisis has not has not induced any kind of efforts to deal with the root causes of zoonotic diseases, namely deforestation and the destruction of the natural world. What you've had instead, of course, is the scramble for vaccines to keep this in check. Or if there is a financial crisis, that's very rarely dealt with at its root level, but rather you have some kind of management of the symptoms. Or if there's a problem with the Palestinians in Gaza shooting rockets, what do? Well, you erect this Iron Dome, this defense system that is supposed to intercept these rockets, and you bomb the Palestinians meanwhile. And solar radiation management is the equivalent of the Iron Dome on a stratospheric scale, where you have a technological system for intercepting some of the sunlight coming into the earth and thereby reducing the temperatures. And the absence of climate action makes me afraid that this is what is in store. And the National Academies of Sciences in the US quite recently published a report calling for a massive research program into solar geoengineering along the lines of we have to have all options on the table. And as one critic pointed out when that report came out, there's no report from that body on how to nationalize the fossil fuel companies and terminate their fossil fuel production. That's precisely because that option is kept off the table that they instead produce a report about solar geoengineering. And I have a feeling that we're sort of sleepwalking into this scenario. It's not much spoken about. It's not something that the left is actively engaging with, and it's a scenario that we are completely unprepared for. What do we do if 5 years down the road, when all of Southern Europe is on fire and the Pacific Northwest, perhaps completely desertified or something like that, the Pentagon decides that now we're going to shoot up these things? What's the response from the left? I don't know, and I think we need to take this scenario seriously because of how bad things are. Yeah, I'll end there.
Okay, Andreas, would you like to take some extra time to make your extra comments? We've got time, it's fine.
Well, okay, yeah, I mean,
as long as it doesn't take 20 minutes, but
no, it won't take.
If you go along for 10 minutes more, it's okay.
Yeah. I mean, I recently wrote a book called How to Blow Up a Pipeline, which is about the tactics of the climate movement, primarily in the global north. And it's a critique of what I consider to be fairly dogmatic strategic pacifism of groups like Extinction Rebellion, perhaps in particular, that says that the climate movement must not ever deviate from absolutely peaceful civil disobedience. XR is on the streets right now in London and doing great things. My problem is not with their actions per se, although they've made certain mistakes, but it's about the idea that we can't do anything else and that we absolutely must not engage in any kind of militant confrontation with the existing order or property destruction or anything that smacks of violence. And after something like this, I feel just even more frustrated about the absence of militant climate activism. And I'm going to COP26 in Glasgow in November. I went to the first COP in Berlin in 1995. And I'm sort of afraid that what I'll see in Glasgow will be just the same kind of activist show that I saw in Berlin in 1995 or in Copenhagen. not far from where I am, in 2015, or in Paris in 2021. No, not 2021. When was it? Sorry, I'm mixing these dates up. COP15 in Copenhagen was in 2009. COP21 in Paris was in 2015. It's hard to keep track of all these summits. Sorry. Anyway, it's a kind of activism that is very polite, very gentle. I mean, 20 years ago here in Europe and in the US as well, there was a moment of quite radical summit protests. I don't know if you remember these with Seattle and Genoa and Gothenburg and Prague and other places. And I mean, the situation is so dire that I think we should have something like that in Glasgow. It's in a sense very, I mean, for me, it's quite mysterious why we still don't see that kind of rage, because people should by now be extremely upset about not only the passivity of governments, but their activity, their direct complicity in the expansion of fossil fuel infrastructure, despite all the disasters that we are living through. Yeah, I mean, I hope there is a militant component to the protests that are coming up in Glasgow, but I'm afraid there won't be, and that this kind of extremely kind and modest activism will continue. And I find, to be honest, I find that frustrating, given how serious the situation is. Yeah, these are perhaps unduly emotional comments from me, but this is how I feel.
Okay, you finished?
Yeah, I think.
All right, so we'll continue with the questions. I will switch to Portuguese so that our friend can make the questions. Pode?
Oi, boa noite.
Poliana, good evening. Poliana will read the questions. First of all, I would like to say good night and thank our speakers for their comments, and also our public, and also those who sent their questions. So the first block of questions will include 5 questions that we have received. The first one, or the first 2, are for Sabrina. So question number 1, sent by Mateus Rodrigues Alves, and he says, Sabrina, what reason leads the radical left not to centralize the ecological crisis and the necessary socialist transition? Along the same lines, Rafael asks the question, Sabrina, how could we bring the Brazilian left to an ecological transition process, and how can we dialogue with developmentalists who defend the destructive rationale of the capitalist movement? For Professor Malm, Victor asks a very long question, and we had to somehow summarize it, but I think we preserved the core of his question, which is the following. You always talk about climatic Leninism, but wouldn't it be more interesting to have a climatic Luxemburgism, that is, a conception of socialism without democracy? Is capital by other means, since capital is a process and only a multiple democracy would be able to eradicate it? Now I will ask other questions that are for both of you. It doesn't mean that you cannot answer the first questions. Well, you can answer freely all the questions you want. So Professor Virginia Fonte, She begins thanking you for your contribution, both speakers, and she asks, the topic of internationalism is of the essence, and both of you showed this. In order to face and struggle against capital, the rights, and the left that presents itself as developmentalist, how can we develop common agendas to workers in the North and the South? It is necessary to overcome the actual difference between North and South, but it seems like corporate interests insist on dominating. How do you analyze the working class struggles in this process? And how can we trust the state, which has been supporting big capital? And the last question is from Professor Eduardo Barreto, and he also begins by thanking you for being with us in this time of day, which is not very favorable for you. His question, the demand for not expanding fossil fuels infrastructure seems to be extremely radical and disruptive for a capitalist society. But the decarbonization targets, wouldn't they require and demand something even more dramatic, such as a speedy decommissioning of the existing infrastructure? If it is the case that we are asking for things that seem impossible, why are we demanding the impossible, which is not sufficient? So now we go back to the speakers for their answers, and then we'll be back with more questions. You may begin, Sabrina. Thank you, Poliana. Well, the radical left, that is the big question, because some things that I always laugh about when I am speaking is that the socialist left has a very powerful imagination. The capitalist system is universalizing, totalizing, and we can imagine a socialist alternative, but we cannot even think of being rid of fossil fuels. We can't think of stopping to eat beef. So many things that are impossible to penetrate. And there are some explanations for this. There are several reasons, actually. We still make a very wrongful interpretation of the revolutionary subject. People simply think about the idea of the revolutionary from the 19th century, the factory urban worker, and that we need to ensure the industry so that they will keep their jobs, and we end up not considering the actual reality of the working class and their diversity with regards to identity and the different kinds of jobs and work, etc. So I think that this is one of the problems. The other problem is temporal. That is, the idea that many things can be left for later. It is a vice, a mechanicism somehow, as if the revolutionary process of rupturing with a capitalist system would happen at a point and in time, and then later we would go and do something else. So with the debate that Andreas brought about the Soviets, when they talked about the condition of women after the October Revolution, that it was not separated from the situation of women before, so that the revolution could happen. So this isolation is very strange, a big contradiction, but it's also very comfortable because it enables you to have very isolated agendas and not make the necessary provocations. I believe that this is also related to a complicated phase where about which I hear a lot, not among the socialist left, although sometimes also, which is the idea that our population is simply not ready for certain debates, for some things. Oh, you want to talk about feminism, about being non-binary and the neutral language, but our people are conservatives. You're going to mix their heads up this way, as if these people would actually help in the revolution. And these things end up being associated with the ecological agenda because we isolate the workers' experience as if it had nothing to do with nature. Some authors relate that to the distancing between the rural and the urban. Marx also exploits that topic when he talks about the exchange of nutrients, when he mentions the ecologically unequal exchange, that you will have a big transition of workers that are in a precarious state in the urban areas, and the production of food will be something separate, and that would be transferred, and one group will have scarcity, the other will have surplus, but you have some kind of an alienation. And this is why I don't like to, especially except when I'm talking about something very specific, such as the agenda of the Ministry of the Environment. I like to talk about ecology and not environment, because it seems like nature for the urban workers is something so far away that when he can get one day a year to go to nature, to go to a waterfall, nature is something that is not part of our reality. Another very good source for our discussion is Henrique Duccio. He talks about the philosophy of the liberation, and he has very interesting arguments. Now, it's curious, in critique to the Gotha program, Marx begins saying that wealth comes from workers, or somebody else says, and he says, no, wealth comes from nature. And the work of workers transform this process. And it seems like Ducci was stuck in this part that Marx discusses, the isolation. And this is very necessary for us to understand the metabolic rupture and this total separation from the system, generating an isolation that is keeping us behind, way behind. Now, to close this, we know that the Brazilian left is extremely fragmented. I wrote a book about that I have a problem with the fragmentation of left in Latin America, and that this causes many frustrations. We waste a lot of time in useless discussions, and we separate ourselves. And when we need to discuss these emergent agendas, these very emerging agendas, people are concerned with who will be on the picture holding the red flag and not with the discussion itself. So this shows a very distorted vision of hegemony. So who will carry the largest flag? And therefore, this many times is understood by the left as if we are hegemonic because they are associating it to us, but our debate is very behind. And Rafael's question mentions the vice that is generalized in Latin America, which actually expresses itself in a variety of forms. So we have developmentism when you think about the partnership between the state and the bourgeoisie, and the idea that we will have a certain level of extractivism and that the industry will be developed somehow in some other way. But in the socialist environment, we have the state developmentalism, where everything is state-owned, but we do it everything as we did before. The only difference being that things now are ours, and that we need to interrupt this typical way of doing things. We need to have more automobile factories, but they will belong to the government. Oh, we're going to have more mining operations, but they will belong to a state-owned company. We know that this is not good. Now, very rapid comment about the Luxemburgism. My understanding is that when you're talking about Leninism here, we're talking about the experience in the Russian Revolution, where it started, and Andreas will bring other critiques in other aspects about Rosa Luxemburg concerning the democratic experience. I don't think there isn't very much overlapping there. Maybe Andreas can correct me in his answer. Oh, I loved receiving a question from Professor Virginia. Internationalism is quite necessary, extremely so, in this situation. And I believe that one thing that brings us great potential is something that is not very much worked on, that is even in the climate agenda. I am completing an article about this, which will eventually be published, where I discuss the democracy in an ecological transition project and how it is necessary so that we can connect our agendas related to reducing production and demands and going back to a greater care for quality of life. That also doesn't mean to eliminate quantity, and we have to remember that quality and quantity in the metabolic sense are a dialectic. And I do believe that there's a good opportunity to connect the women's struggles in the feminist aspect. There is space for that. Her connection crashed. And that we need a coalition from the ground up of social movements in Glasgow. Myself, Silvana Frederici, and others, we discussed that there is a big sensitivity from women to what is happening, because, of course, the problems come first to women. And another point that is more macroeconomic, and that is the integration of industries. So if we think that some places will not be totally autonomous in terms of producing something or having a resource, if we have to limit things, then we must think not only that there will be an exchange of products and resources, but actually a better organization for a productive plans between workers in different places. And that is easier when we think regionally. That is why we need to be connected to what is going on in the rest of Latin America. Many times it is hard because of the size of Brazil and the number of problems that we have to solve here. But when we talk about agendas such as investment in energy, if we are to have a moratorium in the expansion of part of the infrastructure somewhere, it might have to be reallocated to another place. So what will happen with the workers there? It's a matter of re-energizing these organizations in this sense. In recent months, I've been talking to the oil workers, and we're talking about solar, brass, and things like that. And I haven't been with them in a while, but it's interesting to see how in some places the only way of saving our class, our jobs, our accumulated knowledge is with a transition. So the rationale of which best practices are implemented in other places, I think about the Petrobras workers can show that to Pemex workers who are in a much more initial phase of this discussion in Mexico, which is also a country that is very much delving in developmentism. But internationalism goes much beyond that. I think we should discuss this. It would be a broader discussion because the aspect of climate refugees will make things worse, and Brazil will suffer from that. We will have national domestic migrants because we can see that our population distribution is so concentrated in the urban areas that we will have internal displacement, but we will also have to absorb the climate refugees from Central America. And we cannot deny the discussion of internationalism because it will come sooner or later. Now, about Eduardo's question, I do think that it would be wonderful if besides, if we were able to decommission and accelerate the decommission of infrastructure, that would be wonderful. But we have to be careful and strategic to avoid creating even more chaos. We have 7 billion people in very unequal situations, and in many countries, this means a collapse, not of the capitalist system, but of the organization of life itself. And when investments in coal plants was being discussed in India, and at the same time, millions of people were still using animal dung as fuel or fire, or as wood fire. And then you will create this chaos of survival if you try to solve the problem of survival itself. This means that it's crashing again. So I'm talking directly from Germany, and it would be highly feasible, considering the advances the country has made with regards to energy transition, that some of these infrastructures can already be decommissioned even before 2038, as Angela Merkel said. But then we're going into a more peculiar discussion about each specific place, whereas the discussion of the moratorium for new expansions, except for some places where it's very hard to have alternatives, this could also be solved with incentives, with separations. We have been discussing the climate debt and the projects that could prevent the building of coal plant in India, for example. But in general terms, it is possible to talk about the moratorium debate. I was in Canada when the manifesto of Naomi Klein's group was launched there. They were talking about this, but unfortunately, things worsened in Canada because Trudeau came as a big expert, very good marketing, and he deceived many people in Canada, and he deceives many people in Brazil about what his government is. And Andreas told us about this cruel reality of the oil pipelines in Canada. Okay, Andreas, you can answer the questions that were asked of you now.
Yes, so first of all, on ecological
Bem, com
Luxemburgism,
relação à
I'll be all in favor of that.
Luxemburgo, eu acho que estou
Now,
a favor disso.
I'm hearing the Portuguese translation, but that's...
Sorry about that. Sorry, start again, please. Sorry.
Okay, no, that's fine, that's fine. So yeah, the comrade who asked about ecological Luxemburgism should write this up. I'd be all in favor of it. Now, I might disagree a little bit with Sabrina about the compatibility of Luxembourg and Leninism. I think there actually is some overlap between the two, or there could be. But let's not get stuck in that discussion. It's the kind of discussion that tends to fragment the left further rather than unify it. But I think the ecological Luxemburgism and Leninism might very well go together. I think the core point that the comrade wanted to make, if I understood it correctly, is that a transition would imply and even require more democracy, not less. And I'm entirely on board with this position. If you think of the problem of private fossil fuel companies, establishing public control over them is an extension of democracy. It's a very undemocratic situation where you have private property in fossil fuels, and this property valorizing itself through capital accumulation in a way that destroys living conditions around the world. And this happening without any democratic control. And a state taking control of these private entities is a first step towards democratic control over the fate of humanity, essentially. And I think companies that are already state-owned, like Petrobras, could be subjected to much more democratic, popular control than they are at the current moment. And there are also a lot of ideas floating around in the climate movement about how to deepen or revitalize, if that's the term, democratic institutions in the transition. You know, in some countries in Europe, there have been experiments in citizens' assemblies and these things. So I'm all in favor of that. Now, on the working class, well, from a European perspective, I would say that working class struggles are at an extreme historical low, and that the working class as a political force in our countries in Europe is weaker than it has been since the Second International was formed. I mean, we're back to pre-Second International levels, or even pre-First International. I'm not sure how far back in history would have to go to find a working class as weak in political terms as it is now. And that's not necessarily to say that it's poorer in material terms than it has been for 2 centuries, but it's it's decomposed as an organized social force. And the problem, of course, is that this is what makes it so hard to envision a rupture with the capitalist system, because the historical agent of that rupture, the organized working class, is so tremendously weak or even absent. And this even goes for a country like Sweden, that is generally completely irrelevant and insignificant place in the world, but it has had a kind of strange boom in the socialist imagination in recent years because of how much attention the people in and around Jacobin have lavished on Sweden as the kind of model country of social democracy, and a country where everyone is organized in a trade union and things like that. And yes, we do still have a very high level of unionization in this country, but our trade unions are the least interested in climate that I think you can find anywhere in Europe. And there is no connection between the climate movement and the climate concerns and what remains of organized labor in Sweden. It's better in other countries, but I don't see that the organized working class in advanced capitalist countries is anywhere near forming a core of the sort of social subject that can accomplish the transition. It's not the driver of the transition, and I see it. It's very difficult for me to see how it could become a driver. I mean, if you look at a country like Germany, where also the trade union movement is extremely bureaucratized, much like in Sweden, it's been very, very hard to get the trade union movement, I'm thinking particularly of IG Metall, on the right side of the climate struggle. The idea of the Green New Deal is, of course, to make basic working class interests compatible with the transition, and to have a transitional program that makes the working class stronger, not weaker. And this is one of the great advantages, I think, of the Green New Deal, and that's one of the reasons why I personally much prefer the Green New Deal to something like degrowth, which is a kind of competing paradigm on the environmental left in Europe. Because it's very hard to make degrowth compatible with working class interests. But I stress here that it's a matter of compatibility. It's not a question of making the working class in the global north the spearhead of the climate movement, which I find it very hard to see that it would become. Unfortunately, the two main sort of Green New Deal projects in the global north were the Sanders project in the US and the Corbyn project in the UK. And here I would particularly emphasize that the UK Labour Party in the elections of 2019 had a program that was better than anything I've seen any major party in an advanced capitalist country putting out. They said all the right things about climate and how to connect the transition with a redistribution from capital to labor and a strengthening of the working class. Unfortunately, they lost the election because nationalism screws everything up all the time in our countries, and Jeremy Corbyn lost, and the whole project was completely deflated in the UK. But I do think that it's of course the best that we have, and that we shouldn't abandon the Green New Deal. We should try to keep working. Obviously, this is something we can discuss forever. Now, on the question about decommissioning and these things, yeah, Eduardo, you're absolutely right. It's unimaginably radical to imagine an end to new fossil fuel installations. It's even more unimaginably radical to take these installations out of business. One reason that I've toyed with the idea of property destruction, as have quite a few others recently, is that destroying some of the existing fossil fuel property through sabotage would be a way to demonstrate that this is something that can be done, and that you can actually destroy pipelines or coal mines and other kinds of infrastructure. And it's as Sabrina said as well, I mean, it's not technologically in any way inconceivable to decommission this infrastructure. In a country like Germany, it's entirely conceivable. What stands in the way of this decommissioning is the interests of capital to maintain this fixed capital and defend the investments and make sure that all these goods that have been built up over time yield as much profit as possible for as long time as possible. And decommissioning this infrastructure is about liquidating capital. But it's not technologically impossible, because you can, by now, fairly easily replace the fossil fuels that we have in the world, the energy system, with renewables that are across the board becoming considerably cheaper than fossil fuels. And we now have solar power in many parts of the world producing the cheapest electricity in human history. So the sort of paradox or even tragedy here is that technologically it's becoming easier to get rid of all fossil fuels and replace them with renewable energy. But the problem is economic. It's about class power and the power that the capitalist class has over this infrastructure and all that it does to defend it. Yeah, I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much for your answers. And now we'll continue to the second block on issues. And this will be our last block of questions. So the first question that comes is also for the two speakers. And João Leonardo here asked the following. First of all, he congratulated congratulated you for the excellent talks for the two of you. My issue is on the other side. We've been thinking about the path of our praxis, but it's always prudent to remember that possibly we will suffer attack from the ruling classes that are rich and armed. And so he wants to know, what do you think that may happen when the first symbolic tragedies provoke certain fear of the ruling class? How do you expect that the ruling class will respond to that? The second question is that came from the Professor Tatiana. Tatiana, she can do directly the question. Thank you very much. So, my question goes to Professor Andreas. It's about your last book on the black fuel, and on your latest book, Professor tried to see the role of the extreme right under climate crisis. And so my question is related to what you said in this book in relationship of using fossil fuel and fascism. Could you elaborate a little bit more on this discussion, this reflection, very quickly, if you can do so? I believe that now we can give the floor to Professor Andreas, and then we give the floor to Sabrina. Professor, you have the floor.
Yeah, thank you. I'm not sure I really understood the first question. Can you, Sergio, can you repeat it for me, do you think?
Of course, just a second. The professor asked you, we have been thinking about the possible path of our praxis, but it's always prudent to remember that possibly that we were going to have to act under the attack of the ruling class that are always very rich and strongly armed. What do you think that may happen when the first symbolic tragedies would provoke a certain fear of the ruling class? How do you expect that the ruling class will react?
Yeah. But what is the symbolic tragedy that the comrade has in mind? I mean, what is this a reference to? I don't understand. Is this a reference to if something would go wrong with property destruction, or what's the? Do you know?
I have the same question. Like, what would the symbolic tragedies be?
Yeah.
Então, ele coloca, por exemplo...
Well, what he says, for example, the wildfire in Los Angeles as a tragedy. As a symbolic tragedy, would you have fire in Los Angeles? That would be one example.
Like significant. Okay. I get it. That there's something, they stand something that might come in the future. Okay.
Yeah, there was a little bit of a gap in the connection there. I mean, so the question is, how would ruling classes respond to really bad events in their own backyard? Is this something like that?
I believe so.
Yeah, okay.
Sim.
Well, I mean...
Yes, that's it.
Yeah, first of all, being rich means having resources to protect oneself oneself from adversity. So having buffers, having assets that make it possible to weather storms and survive when things get rough. So far, the truly rich people, the richest people on earth, the ones that really control means of production and investment flows and things like that, have not suffered consequences of global heating. And they're preparing. I mean, you have all these rich people building bunkers in the US to hunker down when the apocalypse comes, and they can still have their jacuzzis and their studios and their servants or whatever in the underground in their fancy cellars, and that's going on in London as well. So, and you have this discourse among the billionaires about where on earth to go to protect oneself when things get really bad. Even the New York Times, they ran a piece recently about this and listed the countries that are safest to go to. And part of this ranking, quite remarkably, part of this ranking was in what countries will there not be climate refugees? So what countries are best protected from population flows as as part of the criteria for picking the best destination to go to. So it will take a long time. Well, now global warming is of course happening extremely fast, but it will take a long time, comparatively speaking, for rich people to really suffer, because they are the ones, more or less by definition, who will suffer last. They will be safe for the longest. We don't know how long that will take. So when they suffer, it will be over for everyone else. So these tragedies, if they happen, will come after everyone else has suffered tragedies. So if those ruling classes wake up or react, it will be too late for everyone. So we shouldn't count on that. And so far, I mean, maybe Los Angeles hasn't been on fire, but certainly there have been fires pretty close to Los Angeles, and California is, of course, burning as we speak. And still, you don't see this prompting any kind of serious re-evaluation of what's going on in the US. I mean, it's quite extraordinary, the level of climate denial in that country. I've been keeping my eyes on the Amazon bestseller list throughout the summer, and it's you can go in and have a look. If you go into Amazon.com and you just find the best-selling nonfiction book, it's a book called American Marxism by Mark Levine, with the hammer and sickle in the American flag. And it's about how Marxism is taking over the US. And part of this is, of course, the climate change myth that the Marxists are pushing. I think you will recognize this kind of discourse from the Brazilian context. It's totally pathological, of course. And the pathology of it is that it's selling so bizarrely well. While the US has suffered all these wildfires and the floods and everything, this is the book that is the #1 best-selling book week after week after week after week in the US. Yeah, so the symbolic tragedy, I mean, the ruling class have plenty of ways to process the symbolic tragedies without ever responding to them in anything like a rational fashion. And this brings me to the question that Tatjana asked about our latest book, or the book that I wrote with the Zetkin Collective, White Skin, Black Fuel, which tries to deal with some of these irrationalities. And it's about the role of the far right in the climate crisis. And fossil fascism, we argue, isn't something that exists yet. It's a potential development. And to give a very simple definition of it, I would say that fossil fascism is or would be the aggressive defense of privileges called into question during the climate crisis, in combination with systematic state violence against people defined as enemies of the white nation, or as non-white people. And this can take different forms. It can be the defense of the privileges that come with fossil fuel combustion itself, as when Donald Trump, for instance, did everything he could to just deny the climate crisis and speed up the accumulation of fossil capital. And the far right in Europe generally works to do the same thing. And this has been very bad in countries like Norway and Poland. Norway being the main oil and gas producer in Europe, and Poland one of the largest coal producers, the largest after Germany. Countries that have both had the far right ruling their fossil fuel resources, and just like Trump or Bolsonaro, done everything to speed up the destruction that comes with these fuels. Or it can be the defense of privileges called into question by climate crises themselves. So we've mentioned climate refugees, and that's certainly something that is coming and to an extent already happening. The far right in Europe is the most aggressive defender of all the privileges that have been amassed in Europe over centuries of colonization and unequal exchange, and this adamant refusal to let people from the global south come into Europe and share some of this wealth that we have accumulated just in order to survive. I can go, if you like, more into detail what fossil fascism could mean and under what conditions it could develop. But our argument in the book is that when the far right has come to power in recent years, or when it has come close to power, it has kind of prefigured that scenario by so aggressively defending privileges and turning to as great extent as possible, turning the power of the state against non-white people. And you really see this in Europe, where European politics in general has become completely obsessed with immigration in recent years. I mean, it's the topic that totally dominates European politics in general. As the climate crisis has just deepened and gotten worse and worse and worse, Europe has just discussed more and more and more how bad it is that non-white people are coming to our countries. And that sort of points in this direction. And it's already having very deleterious consequences, both for actual people living in Europe and around Europe, in the vicinity of Europe, and for climate politics. Yeah, I don't know if that's an answer to the question.
That's great. Yeah, it's very interesting indeed. I research fascism, so this is a topic of my particular interest. I will certainly buy your book. So I will switch to Portuguese now so we can close our session for today.
Very well. I'm just going to complete. Can you hear us? I'm sorry, I didn't know that Sabrina was going to say her last words. Sorry. So please do so. I forgot. The chair forgot that Sabrina would have the floor. About the Professor Lamargo's question, I was thinking about some things, because in what we have as defined as eco-fascism, which is also a response to the situation today, a communist thinking protectionism vis-a-vis the ecological crisis, there's also discussion about blood and soil, which is the strong appropriation of the indigenous people identities, belongingness, and we see that in political viable, and we see this going on in Austria. And so this is an idea that they're coming, they're going to steal what's ours. And so Malcolm in Austria calls this immigration. Instead of deporting, he says re-immigration to other places. So this starts out with a discourse there's a strong militias building, and so there's a lot of things going on in this sense. And so this discussion could lead us to a new era of more rigid boundaries or borders. And so these rich will be scared and they will stay in their gated condos where there's security, but there's projects of taking over regions, and there's networking with government, with the state, and increasing the level of phobia that already exists. So this is something that we see and read in many books on dystopia, on dystopic arguments. And so I believe that this also creates a concern for us, because some of these movements, sometimes they're not perceived within the environmentalist movement itself. And due to this discussion, no, we're going to cut, we're going to have conservation. Sometimes we use the language for the environmentalist world. I'm sorry, there's a bad connection. And so this is what is the difference? The image is frozen, I'm sorry. As also, we can see xenophobia and the defense of white supremacy. If we have no questioning, it starts to become very dangerous, and we can be dealing with people that are enemies and they seem like allies. And so if they activate all their racism when things are getting difficult, we know that this is already a strong project. And so we're thinking in the Brazilian case, when the Amazon rainforest is under fire, and that the indigenous people is putting it on fire, this concerns us, because this shows us the idea that there are the others that should take care, the indigenous people, that if they don't take care of their own forests, others could come and take over, and that's the reasoning. And so a company could adopt a forest or a park, and they lose autonomy, the indigenous people. And so before we reach such a situation, and if they get scared and take over, there's already a process underway, a deep process of taking over territories to withdraw of rights. And that is already going on, is facilitating it tremendously, together with the famous hatred of the other. And so when you argue that the other is overpopulated, will bring overpopulation to the world, but because of too many poor people, and so you start building up this scenario, the ideological scenario that is very favorable, that the movements and people that are scared with the ecological crisis are not themselves the ones that are responsible for the crisis. I'm sorry, it's frozen the image and the sound. We can see fascist measures because they naturalize what is the enemy and what should be done vis-a-vis this. So it's extremely dangerous. And even though Andreas have said that fossil fascism is something that is still to be developed, the base already exists. This is already well formulated in the hatred against the migrant, hatred against the poor, and due to the fact that racism that always was present in all this process of imperialism, ecological imperialism or colonization processes, it is easily in the language of people that did not speak these things before, because racism is becoming a vector, very useful to mobilize fear of the other. And so this already prepares the terrain so that when they take over, they will not find so much resistance to projects that will lead to segregation. That what tends to be a history of success. Dystopic is always a story of segregation, and this is what's being prepared to protect themselves. More segregation. Very well. I believe since we don't have more questions and we closed our block for questions, I would like to thank very much here your attendance of our guests, Sabrina and Andreas. It was very good, your contribution was excellent, your contribution. We had a very rich debate here, and I would like to recall to our participants that we will continue with the event tomorrow with our roundtables starting at 3:30 in the afternoon, and then our closing session at 6:30 p.m. tomorrow will be our last plenary session. Very well. So this is what I had to say. So once again, thank you very much, Sabrina. Thank you very much, Andreas, to be here with us today. And thank you, everybody that followed the conference till now. Thank you very much. Good evening.
Thank you, comrades.
Obrigada, boa noite.
Thank you. Good evening.
Thank you.
I hope you managed to follow the questions. You know, Latins, Brazilians speak very fast, Andreas.
No, it was perfect. I hope I didn't speak too fast.
Oh, no, it was fine.
Okay, good.
Okay, goodbye.
Goodbye. Thank you so much, comrades. Thank you.
Right.
Bye.
Thank you, Andreas.
Goodbye, everyone.
Yes, everyone is really late.
Bye.
So
Yeah, it is.
we have
Sorry
to.
about that. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Bom, tchau, João. Obrigado.
Sabrina, você entrou rapidamente, eu estava nervoso com a organização aqui, nem te agradeci pessoalmente em nome do grupo. Enfim, foi
Não, que isso.
sensacional.
Obrigada aos nossos intérpretes também.
Eu peço desculpa para os intérpretes que no começo eu me esqueci, eu acho que eu estava falando bem mais rápido no começo, eu tentei dar uma desacelerada depois.
Depois do Bellamy Foster, sobrevivemos todos. O Bellamy falou em velocidade a galope. E quase morreram. Hoje foi tranquilo, foi ótimo.
Foi tranquilo.
Então tá certo. Gente, muito obrigada. Boa noite para vocês. Tchau, tchau.
Boa noite.
João, mais uma vez, obrigado. 10 anos de NIEP. Maravilha.
10 anos, exatamente.
Mais 10 anos. Esperamos mais 10 anos. Hein?
10 anos nesse evento, que a gente começou em 2009 juntos.
Obrigada. Muito obrigada pela parceria de vocês, hein? Foi excelente o trabalho.
Eu que agradeço. Muito obrigado.
Falou,
muito obrigado. Um abraço grande, sucesso aí no final do colóquio.
Um abraço.
Um abração. Tchau, tchau, Tatiana. Obrigado.
Tchau, tchau.
Tchau.